I still remember the silence on the other end of the line when I told my brother Dave that I was proposing to Lynn. It wasn't a happy silence. It wasn't the kind of silence where someone is catching their breath because they're so overcome with joy for you. It was that heavy, judgmental silence that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings. We were sitting in a small, humid apartment in District 3 of Ho Chi Minh City, the sound of 1,000 motorbikes humming like a beehive just outside my window, and half a world away in suburban Chicago. My brother was probably shaking his head. When he finally spoke, he didn't ask about her personality or what we had in common or how she made me feel. He just asked, "So, how long until you have to start the paperwork for the K-1 visa?" He didn't even call it a marriage. He called it paperwork. That was the baseline for everyone back home. To them, I wasn't a man who had found a second chance at life. I was a mark. I was a ticket. I was a blue passport with a target on my back. They saw a 52-year-old man who had walked away from a decent corporate career and a failed 20-year marriage, and they saw a beautiful 34-year-old Vietnamese woman, and they did the math they'd been taught by movies and cynical news segments. They thought they knew the ending to this story before the first chapter was even finished. But that's the thing about stories. Sometimes the most important parts are the ones no one bothers to look for. My journey to Vietnam didn't start with a search for love. It started with a search for oxygen. Back in Seattle, I was suffocating. I had spent 2 decades climbing a ladder that turned out to be leaning against the wrong wall. After the divorce was finalized and the house was sold, I looked at my bank account and realized I had enough to live comfortably if I stayed in the US for maybe 10 years, or I could go somewhere else and actually live. I chose Saigon because a friend of mine had visited once and said the energy there was infectious. I arrived in July, the kind of heat that hits you like a wet wool blanket the second you step out of Tan Son Nhut Airport. I remember that first taxi ride, staring out the window at the chaos of the traffic. It looked like a choreographed dance of near-death experiences, yet everyone seemed so calm. There was a guy on a scooter carrying a literal refrigerator, and next to him, a woman in a silk dress with a toddler standing on the floorboard. I felt a strange sense of relief. If they could navigate that mess with a smile, maybe I could navigate whatever was left of my life. I met Lynn 3 months later. It wasn't at a bar or a club, and it certainly wasn't through one of those international marriage agencies that my cousins later accused me of using. It was at a small, unassuming coffee shop tucked away in a hem, one of those narrow alleys off Phan Xich Long Street. I was struggling to order a café suada, Vietnamese iced coffee with condensed milk, and I was butchering the tones. The young girl behind the counter was patient, but we were getting nowhere. Lynn was sitting at the table next to mine, working on a laptop. She looked up, laughed softly, and helped me out in nearly perfect English. We ended up talking for 2 hours. She wasn't impressed by my background or my former job title. She was a graphic designer, fiercely independent, and she spent most of our first conversation explaining why the neighborhood we were in was better for food than the touristy District 1. She had this way of looking at me, not like I was a savior, but like I was a slightly confused guest in her home. As the weeks turned into months, I realized I was falling for her, but I was also constantly bracing for the ask. You know the one? Every expat forum, every YouTube comment section, and every well-meaning friend warned me about it. Eventually, the bill would come due. Eventually, she would ask for money for a sick relative, or a new phone, or most importantly, the conversation about moving to America. I waited for it like a man waiting for a storm, but it never came. Instead, she took me to her favorite bun cha spots where we sat on tiny plastic stools that made my knees ache, eating grilled pork and noodles for $3, while she told me about her dreams of opening her own design studio in Saigon. She was proud of her city. She was proud of her life. When I finally brought her around my small circle of expat friends, the tension was palpable. These were guys who had been in Southeast Asia for years, some of them bitter, some of them cynical. They would pull me aside and whisper, "She's a long-termer, Mark. She's playing the slow game. Once that ring is on, she'll be asking for the green card before the cake is cut. I tried to ignore them, but the seeds of doubt are easy to plant and hard to weed out. I started watching her for signs. When she asked me to go with her to visit her family in the countryside, near the city of Can Tho in the Mekong Delta, I thought, okay, here it is. This is where I meet the parents, and they start asking about my retirement fund, or how soon we can get Lynn to California. The bus ride was long and bumpy, filled with the smell of jasmine and diesel. When we arrived, her family home was modest but beautiful, surrounded by pomelo trees and the heavy, sweet scent of the river. Her father was a retired teacher, a man with hands calloused from gardening, and eyes that saw right through me. We sat on the porch, drinking tea, and he didn't ask me about my money. He asked me if I intended to stay in Vietnam. He asked if I was prepared to learn the language, because his daughter deserved someone who could speak to her heart in her own tongue. He wasn't looking for a way out for Lane. He was making sure I wasn't going to take her away and then break her heart in a foreign land. That trip changed everything for me, but it did nothing to change the minds of the people back home. When I sent photos of the trip to my sister, her only response was, "She looks very young. Are you sure she isn't just looking for a sponsor?" It hurt. It hurt because they weren't seeing the woman who spent her weekends volunteering at an orphanage in District 8. They weren't seeing the woman who refused to let me pay for every meal, insisting that we split things because she had her own income. They were looking at a stereotype. By the time I decided to propose, I had stopped talking to most of my friends in Seattle about her. It was easier that way. I bought a ring in a small shop near the Opera House, and I asked her to marry me on a boat in the middle of the Saigon River, with the lights of the landmark 81 building reflecting off the water. She said yes, and for a few hours the world was perfect. Then, the reality of the green card narrative came crashing back. The first thing I did after we got engaged was look into the K-1 visa process. I figured, even if she hadn't asked, it was the logical next step. I grew up believing that the American dream was the ultimate goal for everyone on the planet. I assumed that by marrying me, I was offering her the greatest gift a Westerner could give, a life in the United States. I spent a whole afternoon printing out forms, researching the costs, and looking at the processing times. I felt like a provider, a protector. That night, I sat her down at our kitchen table, a small wooden thing we'd bought at a local market, and I laid the papers out. I said, "Lynn, I've started looking into the visa. We can move to Seattle by next year. My sister can help us find a place, and you can find a job at a design firm there. You'll love the summers, and the health care is." I trailed off because she was just staring at the papers like they were written in an alien language. She didn't look excited. She looked confused, and then, slowly, she looked disappointed. She asked me, "Mark, why would we move to Seattle?" I started listing the reasons: the economy, the infrastructure, the opportunities. She listened patiently, and then she said something that I will never forget. She said, "I have my family here. I have my business here. I have my culture, my food, my friends. In Seattle, I would be a mail-order bride to your neighbors. I would be a woman who can't drive in the snow and who has no one but you. Why would I trade my life for a green card I don't want?" I was floored. I had spent so long defending her against the accusation that she was using me for a visa that I had never considered the possibility that she viewed the visa as a burden, not a prize. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. All those warnings from my brother, all those cynical comments from the guys at the expat bars, they were all based on a version of the world that didn't exist for Lynn. They thought she was the one trying to get something from me, when in reality, I was the one who was assuming her life was somehow lesser because she lived in a developing country. I had internalized the very prejudice I claimed to be fighting. I looked at the papers on the table, the legalistic language and the government seals, and I felt a profound sense of embarrassment. I had been so caught up in the green card drama that I hadn't actually asked my future wife what she wanted for our future. Lynn stood up and walked over to the window. The street below was alive with the sound of a woman yelling about her noodle soup and the rhythmic clack-clack of the Hutio man's wooden sticks. She turned back to me and said, "I love you, Mark. I want to be your wife, but I want to be your wife here. I want us to build a life in a place where we can afford to be happy, not just afford to survive. If you want to go back to America, you can go, but I'm staying in Vietnam." That was the moment the real test began. That was the moment I had to decide if I was marrying her because I loved her, or if I was marrying her because I wanted to play the role of the Western savior. It was the moment I had to face the fact that everyone back home was wrong, but not in the way they thought. They said she'd never leave me alone until she got to America. The truth was, she was telling me she might leave me if I forced her to go there. I spent the next week in a bit of a daze. I walked through the streets of District 1, past the high-end malls and the colonial-era buildings, trying to reconcile the two versions of my life. There was the life I was supposed to want, the one in Seattle, with the SUV and the lawn and the cold, gray winters, and the life I actually had here. In Saigon, I woke up every morning to the sound of the city breathing. I walked down the street, and the lady who sold fruit knew my name and exactly how I liked my mangoes sliced. I had a sense of community that I hadn't felt in 20 years in the States. And most importantly, I had Lynn. She wasn't a project, she wasn't a statistic, and she certainly wasn't a victim. She was a woman who knew exactly who she was and what her worth was. When I finally called Dave back, I told him the news. I told him we were getting married, but that there would be no visa application. I told him I was the one who was going to be applying for long-term residency in Vietnam. The silence this time was even longer. "You're staying there?" he finally asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "For good, Mark? Think about the healthcare. Think about the politics. Think about your 401k. I told him I had thought about all of it. I told him that I could live like a king on a fraction of my savings, that the private hospitals in Saigon were world-class, and that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was running a race I couldn't win. But more than that, I told him that Lynn refused to move to the US. That blew his mind. He couldn't wrap his head around it. "She doesn't want to come here?" he repeated, as if I were telling him she didn't want to win the lottery. "Is she crazy? Or is this some kind of reverse psychology?" It was then I realized that no matter what I said, the people back home would always find a way to make her the villain or the manipulator in the story. If she wanted to move, she was a gold digger. If she didn't want to move, she was shifty or had some hidden agenda. There was no winning with them, so I stopped trying to win. I told Dave I loved him, told him he was invited to the wedding, and then I hung up. I went into the living room where Lynn was working on a new design project, the light from her monitor reflecting in her eyes. I sat down next to her, put my arm around her, and told her I was staying. I told her I wanted to build our home right here, in the chaos and the heat and the beauty of Vietnam. The months leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of cultural immersion that I wasn't entirely prepared for. If you think planning a wedding in the US is stressful, try doing it in a country where tradition isn't just a suggestion, it's a legal requirement of the heart. Lynn's mother, a tiny woman with a backbone made of iron, took charge. There were discussions about the áo dai, the traditional Vietnamese tunic, about the specific number of gift trays I would have to carry to their house, and about the tea ceremony. I found myself in a tailor's shop in the middle of a bustling market, being measured for a silk robe that made me look like a very pale, very confused emperor. The seamstress kept laughing at my shoulder width, calling me Ong Tae with a wink. During this time, I started to notice the little things that make life in Vietnam so different from the sterile existence I'd known before. It's a place of contradictions. You'll see a brand new Mercedes parked next to a street vendor selling grilled corn over a charcoal brazier. You'll see teenagers on iPhones sitting on the ground outside a centuries-old pagoda. But the common thread is the connection. People here don't live behind closed doors. They live on the sidewalk. They live together. I started learning more Vietnamese, taking classes 3 times a week. It's a tonal language, which means if you say ma the wrong way, You might be talking about a ghost, a mother, or a horse. I spent a lot of time accidentally talking about horses, but every time I tried, every time I stumbled through a sentence at the local chuck, the faces of the locals would light up. They weren't looking for perfection, they were looking for respect. They wanted to see that the foreigner wasn't just there to take, but to belong. My sister, Sarah, eventually decided to come to the wedding. She arrived 2 days before the ceremony, looking like she'd just landed on Mars. I picked her up from the airport in a grab car, and as we drove through the neon-soaked streets of District 1, she clutched her purse like someone was going to snatch it at any moment. "It's so loud," she whispered, staring at the sea of motorbikes. I just laughed. "It's not loud, Sarah, it's alive." I took her to a high-end restaurant for dinner, one that overlooked the city, trying to show her the sophisticated side of Saigon. But the real breakthrough didn't happen at the fancy restaurant. It happened the next morning when Lynn took Sarah to a local breakfast spot. I watched from a distance as Lynn showed my skeptical suburban sister how to properly tear the herbs into her pho and how to use the lime and chili to balance the broth. Lynn didn't try to impress her. She didn't talk about visas or money. She talked about her family, about the history of the neighborhood, and about how she had worked 3 jobs to put herself through college. She talked about her pride in Vietnam's growth and her desire to see her own business contribute to it. By the end of the meal, I saw Sarah's shoulders drop. The defensive posture was gone. She was actually listening. Later that night, Sarah told me, "She's not what I expected, Mark. She's very formidable. I don't think she needs you at all." I smiled and said, "I know. That's why I'm so lucky." The wedding itself was a blur of red and gold. The tea ceremony at Lynn's family home was one of the most moving experiences of my life. Standing before her ancestors' altar, bowing to her parents, and promising to care for their daughter, it felt more real than my first wedding in a sterile church in Seattle ever had. There was a weight to it, a sense of joining not just a person, but a lineage. When we moved to the reception at a large hall in the city, the sheer scale of the guest list was staggering. Lynn seemed to know everyone. Cousins, childhood friends, former teachers, neighbors. They all welcomed me with open arms, toast after toast of Mot Hai Ba Jo. I realized then that I wasn't just marrying Lynn, I was being adopted by a community. But even in the midst of the celebration, the green card ghost haunted the edges. One of my old friends from Seattle, a guy named Brian who had flown in for the wedding, got a little too much rice wine in him. He leaned over to me during the dinner and whispered, "So seriously, when are you guys moving to the States? You can tell me. Is it the 2-year plan?" I looked at Lynn, who was laughing with my sister across the table, her face glowing in the warm light. I looked at the hundreds of people who had come to celebrate our union in a city that had become my home. I looked back at Brian and said, "We're not moving, Brian. We're staying here. We're buying a house in District 2. Brian blinked, confused. "But why? You've got the passport, man. You've got the golden ticket." I just shook my head. "You've got it backwards," I told him. "The golden ticket isn't the passport. The golden ticket is being in a place where you actually want to wake up in the morning." After the wedding, life settled into a rhythm that I could never have imagined back in Seattle. We didn't move into a sprawling villa, but into a comfortable, modern apartment in Pho Dien, an area popular with both locals and expats, but still retaining its Vietnamese soul. My days changed. Instead of rushing to a corporate office, I started working as a consultant for local startups, helping them navigate Western markets, while they helped me understand the intricacies of Vietnamese business culture. I traded my morning commute in a climate-controlled car for a 10-minute ride on the back of a motorbike, the wind in my face and the smell of roasting coffee in the air. The green card comments didn't stop immediately, of course. For the first year, every time I called home, someone would inevitably ask if Lynn had changed her mind about moving. It was as if they were waiting for the other shoe to drop. They expected her to suddenly become demanding or to start complaining about life in Vietnam once the honeymoon phase was over. But the opposite happened. As our relationship grew, Lynn became even more entrenched in her life here. Her design studio took off, and she was soon employing 4 other young Vietnamese designers. She was the breadwinner in many ways, her income in HCMC providing a lifestyle that would have required a massive salary in the US. We traveled, not to Europe or America, but to the hidden gems of Southeast Asia. We spent weekends in the cool mountains of Dalat and weeks on the quiet beaches of Phu Quoc. I began to see the green card narrative for what it truly was, a projection of Western insecurity. We want to believe that everyone in the world is desperate to live like us because it validates our own choices. If someone like Lynn doesn't want what we have, it forces us to question if what we have is actually that great. My friends back home were struggling with rising costs, political division, and a sense of isolation. Meanwhile, I was living in a place where the economy was booming, the people were optimistic, and the sense of community was unbreakable. Who was the one who needed saving? One afternoon, about 18 months into our marriage, Lynn and I were sitting at a small plastic table on the sidewalk in District 4. This was a real neighborhood. No fancy malls, just life. We were eating oak, sea snails cooked in lemongrass and chili, and drinking cold beer. The sun was setting, turning the sky a dusty pink above the tangled power lines. Lynn looked at me and said, "You know, Mark, my mother asked me yesterday if you were ever going to make me go to America." I froze, a snail midway to my mouth. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Lynn smiled, that knowing, confident smile that I had fallen in love with. "I told her that you were a Vietnamese man now, that you liked the snails too much to ever leave." We both laughed, but there was a truth in it. I had stopped being a guest. I had started being a resident. But then, the real test came. My father back in the States fell ill. It wasn't life-threatening, but he needed surgery and a long period of rehabilitation. I had to go back to Seattle for 3 months to help him and my sister. This was the moment the skeptics had been waiting for. "This is it," I could almost hear them saying. "She'll either refuse to go with him, or she'll use this as her chance to finally get that visa and stay." I was torn. I didn't want to leave Lynn, and I didn't want to leave my life in Saigon, but I had a responsibility to my family. When I told Lynn, she didn't hesitate. "You have to go, Mark. He's your father." I asked her if she wanted to come with me. We could get her a tourist visa, and she could see where I grew up. She looked at me thoughtfully. "I will come for 2 weeks," she said, "to help you get him settled and to meet him properly. But then I must come back. I have a big project launching, and I can't leave my team for 3 months." So, we applied for the tourist visa. Even that was an ordeal. The interview at the consulate was grueling. The officer looked at our marriage certificate, then at me, then at Lynn. I could see the suspicion in his eyes. He asked her point blank, "What is your intention in the United States?" Lynn looked him dead in the eye and said, "To help my husband care for his father, and then to return to my home and my business in Ho Chi Minh City." The officer paused, then stamped the visa. The 2 weeks in Seattle were eye-opening. Lynn saw the world I had come from. She saw the gray skies, the suburban sprawl, and the way people lived in their cars. She was polite and kind to my father, who absolutely adored her. She cooked Vietnamese food in my sister's kitchen, the smell of fish sauce and ginger wafting through the house, a scent that felt like a beautiful intrusion. But I could see her wilting. She hated the cold. She hated the silence of the neighborhood. She missed the energy, the noise, and the warmth of home. When it was time for her to go back, my brother Dave pulled me aside at the airport. "She's really leaving?" he asked, genuinely shocked. "She's going back there, alone? Without you?" I nodded. "She has a life, Dave. I keep telling you." Watching her walk through the security gate was hard, but it was also the final confirmation I needed. She wasn't holding on to me for a ticket out. She was holding on to me because she loved me, and she was trusting me to come back to the life we had built together. The next 2 months in Seattle were some of the loneliest of my life. I felt like a ghost in my own country. I walked through the grocery stores with 50 different types of cereal and felt overwhelmed by the waste and the excess. I sat in traffic on I-5, and felt my soul slowly leaking out. I realized that the green card wasn't just a document. It was a symbol of a life I no longer recognized as mine. When I finally landed back at Tan Son Nhut, the humidity hit me like a long-lost friend. I walked out of the terminal, and there she was, standing in the crowd, waving frantically. We took a grab bike home, me sitting on the back with my suitcase balanced precariously between my knees, just like I'd seen so many times before. As we zipped through the streets, the neon signs blurring into a streak of color, I leaned forward and shouted over the wind, "I'm never leaving again." Lynn just laughed and squeezed my hand. We weren't going to the US. We weren't chasing someone else's dream. We were exactly where we were supposed to be. The months following my return from Seattle felt like a second beginning. The skepticism from my family hadn't vanished entirely, but it had shifted. It was no longer about Lynn using me. It was about them trying to understand why I would choose a life so different from theirs. My father, now recovering, would call me on FaceTime and marvel at the fruit Lynn brought home from the market. Dragon fruit, mangosteen, durian. He started to see the richness of my life, not in terms of bank balances, but in terms of experience. He saw a son who looked younger, healthier, and more at peace than he had in decades. Living in Vietnam as a long-term expat, especially one married to a local, gives you a perspective you just can't get as a tourist. You start to see the nuances of the culture, the way yes doesn't always mean agreement, and how family obligations are the invisible threads that hold everything together. I learned that when Lynn's cousin needed a loan for a new motorbike, it wasn't just a financial transaction. It was a test of our place in the family hierarchy. I learned that Tet, the Lunar New Year, isn't just a holiday. It's a spiritual clearing of the slate. We spent weeks cleaning the apartment, buying yellow apricot blossoms, and preparing red envelopes for the children. I wasn't just watching these traditions. I was part of them. I was the one responsible for making sure we had enough crisp new bills to give to the neighborhood kids. There were challenges, of course. The bureaucracy in Vietnam can be a labyrinth. Getting my residency permit renewed involved a mountain of paperwork, several trips to government offices where no one spoke English, and a lot of waiting in plastic chairs under whirling ceiling fans. There were moments of frustration when I wanted to scream at the inefficiency, but then I would look at the cost of my high-quality healthcare, or the fact that I could eat a world-class meal for the price of a Starbucks latte in Seattle, and the frustration would melt away. In the US, you pay for efficiency with your time and your stress levels. In Vietnam, you pay for the chaos with a bit of patience, and in return, you get your life back. Lynn's business continued to thrive. She was no longer just a graphic designer. She was becoming a respected creative director in the Saigon scene. One evening, we were at an art gallery opening in District 2, surrounded by young, stylish Vietnamese entrepreneurs. These were people who were fluent in multiple languages, who traveled to Singapore and Tokyo for weekend trips, and who viewed the American dream as a quaint, slightly outdated concept. They were building their own dream right here. I stood there, a drink in hand, realizing that I was the one who had been uplifted by this marriage, not her. She had introduced me to a world that was vibrant, forward-looking, and deeply connected. One of the most persistent myths I encountered, both from people back home and from bitter expats, was that Vietnamese women are submissive. Anyone who says that hasn't spent 5 minutes with a Vietnamese woman. Lynn is the most strong-willed person I've ever met. When we had a disagreement about where to invest our savings, she didn't just nod and agree with the man of the house. She came prepared with spreadsheets, market analysis, and a 3-year plan. She challenged me, pushed me, and made me better. Our marriage wasn't a transaction. It was a partnership of equals. The idea that she was some fragile flower waiting to be plucked and transported to a better life was not just wrong. It was laughable. As we reached our 3rd anniversary, we decided to buy a small house, not in the expat bubble of Chao Dien, but further out, in a developing part of District 9. It was a risk, but Lynn saw the potential. The house was a narrow 3-story building that needed a lot of work. My brother, Dave, when he saw the photos, asked, "Why wouldn't you just buy something finished? Or better yet, why not buy property back here as an investment?" I explained to him that we weren't looking for an investment. We were looking for a home. We spent months overseeing the renovations. I learned the Vietnamese words for plumbing, electrical, and more cement, please. We worked with local craftsmen who took immense pride in their work, even if their methods were different from what I was used to. The house became a symbol of our commitment to Vietnam. We planted a small garden on the rooftop where we grew herbs and chili peppers. We hosted dinners for our neighbors, a mix of young families and older couples who had lived in the area for generations. At first, they were curious about the Tay living among them, but soon I was just the guy who lived in the house with the blue door. They would bring us plates of sticky rice or fruit from their trees, and we would return the favor with Western treats that Lynn had learned to bake. This was the life everyone said I couldn't have here. They said I would always be an outsider, that I would always be a target. But I found that if you approach a community with humility and a genuine desire to contribute, they will open their hearts to you in ways you never thought possible. The green card accusation finally died a quiet death during a visit from my sister and her husband a few years later. They stayed with us in our new house. They saw Lynn running her business from her home office, managing her team with a mix of grace and authority. They saw how she navigated the local markets, how she was respected by everyone from the security guard at the bank to the owners of the most prestigious firms in the city. They saw our life, the balanced, peaceful, and joyful life we had built. On their last night, we were sitting on our rooftop garden, the lights of the city twinkling in the distance. My brother-in-law, a man not prone to emotional outbursts, looked around and said, "I get it now, Mark. I actually get it. Why would she ever want to leave this? You've got a better life here than most people I know back home." That was the moment the weight finally lifted. I didn't need to defend my marriage anymore. The reality of our life was the only defense I needed. Lynn wasn't my ticket to a tropical fantasy, and I wasn't her ticket to a Western paradise. We were just two people who had found each other in a big, messy world and decided to make a stand in a place that made us both feel whole. Of course, living here isn't a fairy tale. There are days when the noise is too much, when the pollution gets to me, or when I miss the simple ease of a Western grocery store. There are days when the cultural gap feels like a canyon, and Lynn and I have to work hard to bridge it. But those challenges are part of the growth. They are what make the relationship real. If everything were easy, it wouldn't be worth as much. We've had to learn how to communicate across languages and traditions, how to compromise without losing ourselves, and how to build a shared identity that is neither purely American nor purely Vietnamese, but something entirely new. I often think back to that first phone call with Dave, the one where he asked about the K-1 visa. I think about how much fear and misunderstanding was packed into that one question. It makes me sad for the people who let those fears stop them from exploring the world, or from opening their hearts to people who are different from them. They are missing out on so much beauty. They are trapped in a narrative that tells them they are the center of the universe, when the truth is that the universe is vast, diverse, and full of surprises. Today, Lynn and I are talking about the future, not about moving, but about expanding. She wants to open a second office in Da Nang, and I'm looking into starting a small nonprofit to help local kids learn coding. We are invested in this country, in its people, and in each other. When people ask me if I ever regret leaving Seattle, I don't even have to think about it. My only regret is that I didn't do it sooner. I look at Lynn, and I don't see a green card story. I see my wife, my partner, and the person who showed me that true love isn't about finding someone to save you, but about finding someone to build a world with. The skepticism of others is a reflection of their own limitations, not yours. If I had listened to them, I would still be sitting in a gray office in Seattle, wondering what happened to my life. Instead, I'm sitting on a balcony in Saigon, the air smelling of rain and jasmine, waiting for my wife to come home so we can go get some noodles at our favorite spot down the street. It's a simple life, but it's a real one. And in the end, that's all that matters. Looking back, the most ironic part of the whole green card saga was how it actually strengthened our bond. Every time we faced a new wave of doubt from the outside world, it forced us to turn toward each other and reaffirm our own truth. It made us more intentional about our choices. We didn't just slide into a life together because it was the easy thing to do. We chose it, every single day, in the face of a world that told us it was impossible or fraudulent. That kind of shared struggle creates a foundation that is incredibly hard to shake. I remember one particular evening, about 4 years in, when we were visiting Lynn's parents again. Her father, who had become a dear friend to me despite our language barrier, took me out to the garden to show me his new pomelo grafts. We stood there in the fading light, the river humming nearby. He turned to me and, in his limited English mixed with my improved Vietnamese, said, "Mark, at first I was afraid. I thought you would take her away and she would become a ghost in your country. But you stayed. You became a son." He patted my shoulder with his rough, soil-stained hand. That meant more to me than any validation from back home ever could. I wasn't just a guy who married a local. I was a part of a family. And that's the real story, isn't it? It's not about visas or passports or exchange rates. It's about the human capacity to find home in the most unexpected places. It's about the fact that love doesn't follow a script written by cynical strangers. People will always try to reduce your life to a stereotype because it's easier than trying to understand the complexity of your reality. They'll call it a green card marriage because they can't imagine a world where a woman like Lynn would choose a life in Vietnam over a life in the West. But their lack of imagination isn't your problem. I think about the guys I still see sometimes at the expat bars in District 1, the ones who have been here for years but still talk about the locals as them and they. They are the ones who are truly lost. They are living in Vietnam, but they haven't let Vietnam live in them. They are still waiting for the ask, still waiting to be cheated, still waiting for the bill to come due. They are so busy protecting themselves from a perceived threat that they've missed the opportunity to actually connect. I feel for them, but I also know I can't change them. All I can do is live my life as a testament to a different way. Lynn and I recently started the process for me to get a more permanent form of residency, a 5-year visa exemption based on our marriage. As I sat in the immigration office, the same one where I had once felt so much anxiety, I felt a strange sense of calm. The officer looked at our photos, not just the wedding ones, but the ones of us building our house, the ones of us at family Tet celebrations, the ones of us just living. He smiled, stamped the book, and handed it back. "Welcome home, Mr. Mark," he said, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest. I didn't feel like a target. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. So, to anyone out there who is thinking about making a move like this, or who is currently facing the judgment of friends and family, listen to your heart, but also listen to the person you're with. Don't assume you know what they want. Don't assume your culture is the prize. True love isn't a transaction, and it doesn't need a visa to be valid. It's found in the quiet moments, in the shared struggles, and in the decision to build a life on your own terms, no matter what the rest of the world has to say about it. My life in Vietnam isn't perfect, but it's mine. And Lynn isn't my Vietnamese wife. She's my wife, who happens to be Vietnamese, and who happens to have a clearer vision of what a good life looks like than anyone I ever knew back in Seattle. We are staying here, not because we have to, but because we want to. And that, more than any passport or piece of paper, is the greatest freedom of all. I often think about what my life would look like if I had listened to the voices of doubt. I would be back in that rainy city, probably on my second or third cup of overpriced coffee, scrolling through a life I didn't really want, feeling the years slip away like sand through my fingers. I would be safe, sure. I would be normal in the eyes of my peers, but I wouldn't be happy. I wouldn't know the feeling of riding through a monsoon on a scooter, laughing because I was already soaked to the bone and there was nowhere else I'd rather be. I wouldn't know the deep, resonant peace of sitting in a Buddhist pagoda in the early morning, watching the incense smoke curl into the air while my wife prays for our family's health. The world is much bigger than the small boxes we try to fit it into, and true love, the kind that lasts, the kind that changes you, doesn't care about borders. It doesn't care about the green card narrative. It only cares about the truth of two people standing together, facing the world and saying, "This is where we belong." If you're watching this or listening to this, and you're feeling that tug toward a different life, don't ignore it. But also, don't go looking for a savior or a ticket. Go looking for a partner. Go looking for a place that challenges you to be a better version of yourself. And when you find it, hold on tight. And don't let the cynical voices of the world pull you away. Because at the end of the day, they aren't the ones living your life. You are. And life, especially a life lived with someone you truly love in a place that makes you feel alive, is too short to be lived according to someone else's fears. Vietnam gave me more than just a lower cost of living or a beautiful wife. It gave me a perspective that I was blind to for 50 years. It taught me that happiness isn't something you acquire, it's something you participate in. It's in the chow boi sang from the neighbor, the shared bowl of noodles, the collective effort to build something new from the ground up. It's a lesson I'm still learning every day, and I'm grateful for every tonal mistake, every humid afternoon, and every moment of cultural confusion that brings me closer to the truth. Everyone said she married me for a green card, but as it turns out, she was the one who gave me a ticket to a brand new world, and I'm never looking back.